Well, yeah, that's why I'm shooting this little test, is because the real logistics of where we can fit the camera and actually get a shot and get the scene and then sort of tell the story, which is out here somewhere.
It was amazing when George presented Phantom Menace to us. The idea that we could even do it in time or even do it at all seemed pretty much impossible. But we all just focused on it and just said, okay, let's do this, and divided the show up. The work was always conceived from the beginning to not so much do synthetic CG backgrounds, but to try to have those all be real, you know, real locations, real miniatures that we could do some work on. But the CG was used for the characters and for the compositing, and that's, I think, was really a good way to go, because at that time we didn't really have the tools to make landscapes and all look very real. And any time, I still feel this, any time that you can start with something real, you should use it, because it forces the work up to that level. And I think that combination of the two always keeps you sort of on your toes. Is this real or is this fake? But you buy into it and you believe it.
In The Phantom Menace, we visit Naboo, which is the home planet of the Queen. And it's a critical planet because it's kind of the center of, you know, the start of Episode 1. And for the aesthetic of it, I mean, it was really interesting because, you know, at this time, this was before the Empire, and George really wanted to create an aesthetic where it was a mix of different styles. And in some ways, it was a lot more romantic.
Yeah, and even here, you could put ivy sort of growing up.
It's a society that's very integrated in terms of technology with nature. And once we settled on that idea, it really grounded the look of the planet.
The big battle was pretty difficult at the time, because nobody up until that time had done a synthetic battle with like thousands of soldiers, or, you know, people fighting each other, creatures fighting each other. It's been done a lot since, but that was, as far as I know, it's the first time it had really been done without using real people, you know, all computer graphics. We didn't do any sort of crowd simulations or anything like that with emotions. They were all real motion capture or hand animated characters all the time that we just replicated over and over and shifted them around a little bit so that you couldn't tell one character was moving the same way as another. But then they get into a battle and we've got all the traditional sort of more Star Wars-y type explosions and stuff like that. And you know, we used everything we could think of. Mostly there was a lot less computer graphics than people might think. We did a lot of stuff with real explosions, real miniature ships that you see going along on the ground that crash. We had a really nice model shop here, and at the time that seemed to be the best way to do it. And I still think it was, because it looks pretty good.
On Naboo, there is these other society which is complementary to the Queen's world, which are the Gungans. And it was really interesting because George had this brilliant idea of creating sort of this underwater society. The Gungans actually had this technology of force fields, and they can create these bubbles underneath the ocean. And that was a really fun thing to explore, because visually it's stunning, of course, because you're literally in a world of windows. One of the wonderful challenges that George kind of laid on all of us was, okay, we're going to create something visually stunning, but he also wanted to really lay down the foundation that it had to look believable. It had to have logic and in a sense that, no, this world really could exist.
It really has to do with when you see the cut sequence. He's way down at the end of the tunnel. It's real tiny.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of say, oh, monster.
Okay.
The underwater sequence, I'd always wanted to do something like that, and especially wanted to do something with sort of that manta ray designed ship. George was pretty open in shot designs, and I came up with a lot of the stuff that showed the different size scales of the fish, how to, you know, with ideas about how to set the shots up so that you always thought you were seeing a bigger fish, which is sort of the punchline to the entire sequence.
When I first saw the finished film, I was really thrilled. I mean, it was in many ways what we saw in our mind's eye come to life. I spent, you know, literally years working on the planet itself, trying to design the aesthetic for it. And the execution by ILM was just flawless. I mean, it just looked great.
That's it. Tatooine.
Tatooine is a key planet. Of course, it's where where we discover Anakin. And as it relates to the whole Star Wars universe, it's really the center of where it all starts. To actually have the opportunity to go back and build on those designs was fantastic. Of course, George wanted to push the boundaries even further, and so we took the design philosophy established by Ralph McQuarrie and others and started to really think, okay, how would this society actually function? I basically took Luke's homestead, which is a really elegant design, and just extrapolated it out.
Tatooine's the only location in Episode 1 that we visit that's shared from the original trilogy, and so it was important to me that it still could feel like the same planet. Tunisia was a very difficult location, mostly because of the temperature. We ended up shooting starting end of July into the first part of August, when Anakin and Shmi are saying goodbye. That sequence, it was 126.5 degrees when we shot that scene. Those are temperatures I've never experienced before, and I hope I never experience again.
I don't think they're going to need to build anything. I mean, they need to build just a little tiny bit of the ramp on a blue screen set.
The effects work is mostly set extensions. So when the Queen ship is parked in the desert, we really just had the ramp there. Any of the wider views was an 8-foot-long miniature that we had of the ship and splitting that all in. We had set extensions inside of the Mos Espa city. The set build went up to about 12 feet, and then we extended it and made the city larger and populated it. We added droids and other creatures.
As George was writing the story, he needed a centerpiece for this big action sequence, which was this huge race, which we called the pod race. We started researching Southwest in terms of butte formations, looking at the Grand Canyon for rocks, looking literally everywhere we could find exotic rock formations in the desert, and we just merged them all together.
A lot of shots were traveling at tremendous speed, and at the beginning of a shot, something that's way on the far end, way out on the horizon, would be going past camera. So it either meant tremendously large miniatures or helicopter plates, but exotic terrains that George wanted didn't really exist anywhere. That really leaves computer graphics of some kind as about the only real solution. To begin with, we started in the hangar beforehand. We had a partial set that we shot in Leavesden in England. And then the large pod race arena was about a 40-foot miniature that we shot out in the back lot, back at ILM, populated largely with ILM employees. It was a combination of computer-generated people and blue screen elements that we shot for mid-range shots. And then for shots in the pod race, we're actually flying through the arena. We had a bunch of colored Q-tips that were in the stands, and by playing fans across the back of it, you could get some subtle motion in the crowd so that they had an appearance of being alive. George pointed out that the thing about Tatooine is the skies aren't blue, that they actually have a grayness to them. And when we were in Tunisia, he's exactly right. You have this kind of yellowish dust that gets swept up into the sky and is kind of suspended in the air. And that yellowish tone of the dust neutralizes the blue of the sky and kind of adds up to a kind of a grayish horizon. And so we tried to make sure that was always present in the shots that we did.
It was very interesting to build 18-pod engines, the engines and the pods. Well, the engines are the size of 747 engines. I mean, they're just huge. They're 20, 25, 30 feet long, 12 to 15 feet wide, which is over the maximum that any truck is allowed to take. And that becomes immediately a challenge. And it's also something we could never have done in the heat of Tunisia. It just would have been impossible. I think all of the engines took about 12 weeks to build. To have that kind of crew working in that kind of environment would have been very, very difficult. And it was much easier to build them and then transport them. The transport was fantastic, though. It was a really major thing. We could only drive at night. We had ferries that we had to put them on. We even flew a lot of the engines in a Russian MTV 800, which is the largest transport plane in the world. That was a lot of fun. Well, one of the problems about Episode 4, A New Hope, was that none of the records really remained for Tunisia. They hadn't had an opportunity to really find all the locations before they went there. They were on the move from the main part of Tunisia to a little island called Jerba, and no one had kept accurate records of where every single location was. And since we were not replicating them, but we were going to be in the same world, we wanted to try and find an area that would be much simpler than episode 4 was to shoot. And we needed to find an area that would combine all the elements of all the disparate locations that they went to. As it turned out, there was a very interesting article that had been given to me at Lucasfilm about a young guy who was getting his PhD. He was an archaeologist, and he decided to make archaeology very fun. So his thesis was written on where were the original locations on episode 4. And as soon as I read it, I realized he was the only guy. He'd spent months and months in the desert tracking down every single location. So I called him up. He was a really nice guy. And we sent him out to Tunisia, and we met him there. He immediately proceeded to show us where all of the locations, because all of us were obviously not on the original Star Wars. When we were traveling with David throughout all the areas, there was one little section in Jerba, whereas the main cantina was, and it had been rebuilt. It was a brand new modern street. I mean, there were basically condominiums surrounding it, and there was no way to actually picture where the original cantina was. But David knew precisely where it was because he had been there years before, and we were trying to talk to someone, and he took us into his garden. And as we were walking into his house, we saw one of the original Coppolas in his garden, which he was now growing vegetables in. And we suddenly started to discover pieces, and we found the actual original cantina door about a quarter of a mile away, and it was being used as a door to protect a chicken farm. It was just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. We saw it in the middle of nowhere. So there were little pieces, and we saw an older man, maybe in his late 80s, walking down the street with the original Star Wars t-shirt, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that that was probably worth $10,000 now.
You don't think Anakin can win?
Don't get me wrong, though. I have great faith in the boy. It's a credit to your race. But Sebulba there is going to win, I think.
Oh, no! Why do you think that?
He always wins. I'm betting heavily on Sebulba.
I'll take that bet.
What?
I'll wager my new racing pod against, say, the boy and his mother.
A pod for slaves? Well, perhaps. Just one. The mother, maybe. The boy isn't for sale.
He's just a small boy. He can't be worth that much.
No.
For the fastest racing pod ever built.
No.